The Simpsons Treehouse of Horror is an annual tradition that began with the series' second season in 1990 and has continued until today. That's 33 episodes and over 100 short stories. Today I'm going to be ranking the shorts from the classic Simpsons, seasons 2 to 8. There's always going to be arguments about where to end that period, but in my view, those are the best years. There's no one criteria for the best story, although humor, inventiveness, and horror elements all play a part. With that in mind, the worst of the 21 classic shorts is If I Only Had a Brain. Inspired by Frankenstein, Homer is fired from his job and starts a new one at the cemetery. He's then captured by Mr. Burns and has his brain transferred into a new robotic body. The biggest problem is there is nothing noteworthy about it. No particularly memorable jokes, moments, or scares. It's also a very predictable episode, and even the final twist is not particularly interesting. An utterly forgettable tale in a series full of incredible ones. Bad Dream House is up next, and it's a fairly generic parody of the Amityville Horror, or Poltergeist. That's the single biggest problem with it. It's a broad stab at the horror genre, with a number of miscellaneous references but nothing specific. The family so quickly turns to murder that it loses any impact, although Maggie with a tiny knife is fairly cute. Homer's call with the real estate agent is worth a chuckle as well, having been told 5 or 6 times that the house was built on a Native American burial ground. Ultimately, though, it's unfocused and doesn't have any classic lines to make up for it. The Genesis tub is an adaptation of a Twilight Zone episode, which occur about once in every anthology. Lisa accidentally creates a little civilization, and then they shrink her down and she becomes the queen of it. While the idea is decent, and it's a fun episode visually, there's not enough time to get into interesting themes. The idea is done much better in Futurama's Godfellas, which has more time to breathe and shows both the rise and fall of civilization, whereas Tub only has the rise. Bart as the Devil is an interesting concept, but again it gets glossed over in the runtime. Attack of the 50-Foot Eyesores is one of the only original stories, with Lightning bringing a number of advertising mascots to life after Homer steals a giant donut. They manage to tell a decent story, with Lisa finding the ad executive who created them, talking to him, and discovering they don't have power if they're ignored. Unfortunately, it's a little light on the comedy, although Bart being the shoulder angels for the devil is an amusing if obvious gag. It's not a bad short, but with little horror or humor, it falls into the lower quarter. The Bart Zone is surprisingly enough an interpretation of a Twilight Zone episode. Specifically, It's a Good Life, which is often ranked as one of the best of the original series. The Simpsons version is a fairly standard adaptation with relatively few changes. It loses a lot of the dread the original had, and unfortunately the jokes take away from the overall story rather than adding to it. The ending twist, the Bart is terrified about having a good relationship with Homer, is a solid one, and redeems some of the more blasé portions of the episode, but overall, it's mediocre. The Monkey's Paw is another entry from Treehouse of Horror 2, which is by far the weakest one. It's a combination of a short story and a Twilight Zone episode, and features Homer finding a wish-granting monkey's paw, but each wish has horrible consequences. It starts off well, with some good jokes and suitable atmosphere, but the middle portion is a bit of a bore. It picks up at the end, however, with again some good jokes as Flanders rights all the wrongs that The Simpsons caused. Hungry Are the Damned is yet another Twilight Zone episode, this time with the aliens Kang and Kodos, who became mainstays for the series, appearing in almost every Treehouse of Horror. This one has some solid jokes, and the family being let down by Lisa's nosiness is on brand, but it feels like it's missing some greater purpose or drive. It's a fine episode, and the alien designs are great, but there's no singular line or image that stands out. King Homer is surprisingly a King Kong parody, and although it's a fairly direct adaptation, it has some great jokes that make up for the necessary story beats. Candy Apple Island and the always popular Weak Mr. Burns stand out, and the black and white was a bold choice that generally works well. The ending loses something by having the monkey survive and get married to Marge, which brings it down over some of the other choices. Bart Simpson's Dracula is the Simpsons version of the classic film, with some impressive visuals, solid references, and some great jokes. This is when the parodies really came into their prime, taking elements from the original stories while still having enough time to include classic Simpsons humor, like the news report and some crazy grandpa. The ending is a bit out of nowhere, but it fits in with the holiday theme. The Devil and Homer Simpson is next, where Homer offers his soul for a donut, and Flanders as the devil provides. At this point, all of these episodes are super solid, and while the actual plot for this one's fairly short, the jokes in it are among the best. Lionel Hutz is the MVP of the episode, with every line of his a bit of gold. Both Bart and Mr. Burns being associates of the devil is also a great touch. Homer eating all the donuts in hell is also a horrifying image. While the episode lacks a bit in Halloween theatrics, everything else is great. Dial Z for Zombies is a solid send-up of zombie films, with some Pet Cemetery in there. The writing is a little bit loose. It cuts from them raising the dead to the next day at school, but the jokes are generally high quality and the action is entertaining. Barney gets a fun little cameo where he's adopting the zombie lifestyle, and the various historical characters are fun. The zombies rejecting Homer due to lack of brains is an expected joke, but it works well. Next is Citizen Kang, a political stand-up of the 1996 presidential election, and a relatively original story. It's broad political satire, commenting on the nature of the two-party system, as well as the ignorance of the common man. Many of the issues discussed are still shockingly relevant today, especially abortions for all, so despite the relatively in-its-time idea, it still works on not only a comedic level, but also a commentary on America. This could easily be higher, but there are so many good episodes. Don't blame me, I voted for Kodos. Homer Cubed is a solid episode that ranks higher due to its scope and ambition more than its actual quality. It was released 1 month before Toy Story, but still has some decent 3D animation, especially when Homer falls into the real world. It's definitely a time capsule, but the idea of getting lost in another dimension is inherently frightening, so it's got some decent cosmic horror in there. It's an adaptation of a Twilight Zone episode, but it feels unique and fresh. There's definitely a bit of dithering about in the second half, but the novelty more than makes up for it. The Shinning is next, and this is the one that plays things a little too close to the source material, while not having the time to follow through. Despite this, it's elevated by really solid humor. The elevator of blood, the typewriter, Homer devouring the entire fridge, there's a lot to like and a lot to laugh at. In each entry in the 5th Treehouse anthology, Willie appears and is killed, so his role here is both a solid gag and a setup for a very funny recurring joke. It's a good time all around. Time and Punishment is purely a comedy-focused episode, a sci-fi romp with Homer accidentally changing the timeline over and over. It starts off with some good physical humor, then a grandpa joke, then Flanders is a villain, and a solid montage of different realities. I think if the episode was fully focused on the first change, to the Ned dystopia, the episode would have been better for it. But overall the quantity and quality of jokes is top-notch. Terror at 5.5 feet is another Twilight Zone, but the key differences make it one of the best examples. It's on Bart's bus instead of a plane, and gets all of the school staff and kids involved, making for some amusing interactions. The Gremlin has solid monster design, and the Gremlin joke is top-notch. It's exciting, tense, and has some good violence and a mix of expected jokes and subversions. Toss in a solid cliffhanger, and it's one of the best. The Thing and I has a few things going for it. One is the voice performance by Nancy Garthwaite, the second is the relatively unique premise and execution, and the third is one of my top 5 jokes for The Simpsons. The single moment elevates it to the top 5, but there's so many little jokes that are great. A routine soul smear, the pigeon rat, the Ming vase, the opening act even has some decent horror elements. The episode is overall great, but that one picture punch elevates it above the rest. Nightmare on Evergreen Terrace is obviously a parody of Nightmare on Elm Street, and a very direct one at that, but it's so damn well executed that it ranks above the other oblique parodies. The PTA meeting is joke after joke, beginning with classic Smarch Weather. The writers understood what made Freddy such an effective villain, and some of the dream sequences are better than the later Nightmare films. When a parody exceeds the quality of its origin, that's when you've got something great. Nightmare Cafeteria is a commentary on the public school system, as well as a fun cannibal romp, if those exist. The best part is how transparent the teachers are about eating the kids, with Skinner having some great jokes as he laughs in their face. Marge also saying they're old enough to solve their own problems is such a funny idea. The episode is one of the more gruesome as well, playing up the horror elements in the third act with blood dripping from the staff, and the giant fan they end up falling into. It's also a story without a happy ending, as it cuts off just before they're about to be shredded, a fairly unique conclusion to the shorts. Clown Without Pity is not in fact a Chucky parody, but yet another Twilight Zone episode. Despite this, it offers a good mix of laughs and tension. I always laugh at the dolls trying to kill me and the toasters laughing at me. That combined with the bottomless pit, the curio shop, and Homer slamming the door into Milhouse means it's probably the funniest Treehouse of Horror segment, and that counts for a lot. There's only one more to go, and if you've been paying attention, you'd know it's The Raven. Just a dramatic reading of the poem by James Earl Jones, with some occasional commentary by Bart and Lisa. The animation is the best of the season, and while the actual dialogue avoids jokes, there are a number of visual ones that resonate well. Everyone does their best here, and it leaves such an impression that I'd say it's the most well-known adaptation of the poem, and may have been the introduction to Poe for many. So with all that in mind, here's an approximate tier list, from best to worst. I hope you've enjoyed this look back at the Treehouse of Horror, and it would be a great help to me if you could like, subscribe, comment, and be well.